All right, for more on the state of the transition, joined now by Politico's Ken Vogel and Time Magazine contributor Jay Newton-Small. So let's start on this issue of Mitt Romney, this choice Trump may be making here between Mitt Romney, Rudy Giuliani. Ken, you got Gingrich, you got Huckabee. Nobody I can think of in politics drove them more crazy than Mitt Romney when they ran against him. So their sort of angle here, I think, is pretty clear. But it does raise the question, Donald Trump, as he makes these deliberations, do they have his ear? Does a Huckabee, does a Gingrich, do the anti-Mitt Romney forces have his ear?
I think Gingrich probably has his ear to some extent because he was an early adopter of got on the Trump train early while a lot of other Republicans were still dragging their feet. And a lot of this does come down to just those who are Trump loyalists and those who are not. Obviously, Mitt Romney in the latter category, Rudy Giuliani in the former category. One thing I do think we have to look at with Romney, as well as the DeVos pick and some of the folks on the transition team executive committee, is an appeal not just to the GOP establishment, but to the GOP establishment donor class. Obviously, Mitt Romney has a huge Rolodex, probably the best on the right of major donors. DeVos is a major donor. Becca Mercer on the transition committee, Anthony Scaramucci on the transition committee. Their major donors are going to be able to help to fund the inauguration and bring along folks who are going to fund the RNC through the 2018 elections and possibly a Trump re-election in 2020. I don't think we can overlook that angle.
Well, both Mitt Romney and Nikki Haley were fierce critics of Trump during this campaign. This was Romney back in March.
Mr. Trump's bombast is already alarming our allies and fueling the enmity of our enemies. He creates scapegoats of Muslims and Mexican immigrants. He calls for the use of torture. He calls for killing the innocent children and family members of terrorists. This is the very brand of anger that has led other nations into the abyss. Donald Trump is a phony, a fraud. His promises are as worthless as a degree from Trump University.
And Nikki Haley delivered the Republican response to the State of the Union address this year, and she used that speech to go after Donald Trump.
During anxious times, it can be tempting to follow the siren call of the angriest voices. We must resist that temptation.
And you were talking about those loudest voices, those angriest voices. In that context, you were referring to Donald Trump, correct?
He was one of them, yes. Mr. Trump has definitely contributed to what I think is just irresponsible talk.
Donald Trump is everything I taught my children not to do in kindergarten. I will not stop until we fight a man that chooses not to disavow the KKK.
Well, Jay Newton-Small, we heard Mike Huckabee there a few minutes ago in that clip we played saying, look, Donald Trump's base, Donald Trump's voters, his supporters won't stand for this. You can't put somebody in a position like Secretary of State like Mitt Romney, who said those kinds of things about Donald Trump and never repudiated them, never backed off them. Is there anything to that risk that Donald Trump would face in putting somebody like that forward?
Well, Steve, I think this is going to be the inherent tension of Donald Trump's entire tenure, especially as he begins to even think about eyeing re-election, is sort of caretaking that angry base that got him into this position, that got him elected, and making sure that they're taken care of and they're well represented. And he's done that last week with his appointments of Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor, of Mike Pompeo as head of the CIA, of Jeff Sessions, Jeff Sessions of the CIA, or Jeff Sessions as AG. And so you saw him sort of do these really bombastic firebrand appointments, and now he's looking more towards branching out and to bridging to the establishment Republicans who he has to work with for the next 4 years. He has, they control Congress. These are people who obviously did not want to see him elected, fought very hard in the Never Trump groups to never see him elected, and now he has to bridge back and make sure that the party's really united behind him. And so he's essentially creating a team of rivals. I mean, if he does pick Mitt Romney, if he does have Nikki Haley in his cabinet, he's creating a team that's going to debate very vociferously amongst themselves, and it's going to be incredibly interesting to watch those debates because they do represent two sides sides of a Republican Party that he now has to bridge and represent the whole party.
But Jay, I get the feeling, too, that the decision here Trump's facing on Secretary of State is bigger even than that, not just the question of establishment Republicans. Ken's talking about the donor class that obviously is cheering for a Mitt Romney here. But I've been hearing a lot of Democrats out there, a lot of Trump critics say this is sort of the signal that would not that they're going to be Trump supporters, but that would reassure him that there's going to be some stability in this administration.
Absolutely, and this is like sort of the, hiring the adult, the grown-up to put a really good face on whatever happens, whatever Trump decides to do in foreign policy to the rest of the world. And Mitt Romney has that gravitas. He, as Donald Trump said himself, he looks like he was born to play the part of Secretary of State. And so he brings to that office a lot of credibility. And his foreign leaders especially are very, very worried about what Donald Trump might do. He's much more isolationist than George W. Bush or even than Barack Obama. Withdrawing from international coalitions like NAFTA or NATO. These are his job is going to be to reassure our international partners that no, Donald Trump isn't going to blow up the world and make massive change. And that's a great face to put on it. It's a very calm and reassuring face, and it's one that I think also calms and reassures a lot of people on Capitol Hill, Democrats, Republicans alike, who are very worried that Donald Trump really might basically screw up a lot of our relationships around the world.
But let's not forget here, guys, Mitt Romney, you're right. He is certainly a respected voice in the Republican Party and across politics more broadly, but he also doesn't have a ton of experience in foreign policy. It's true, he's a serious guy, and he really boned up on it, and he pressed the case very aggressively against Barack Obama, including presciently calling Russia our #1 geopolitical foe during a debate in 2012. But he's a former governor and private equity guy. He very much fits in with this mode that we are seeing so far of Trump nominees and prospective nominees who don't really have a ton of subject area expertise, let alone relevant government expertise.
Quickly though, Ken, is it durable though? If Donald Trump, if Mitt Romney is Secretary of State and Donald Trump goes and says something or tweets something intemperate or just something that causes a big controversy, is Mitt Romney going to be able to sit there and not say anything when every reporter's asking him, do you endorse what Trump just said? Do you stand by what Trump just said? And if Mitt Romney says or does something that Trump perceives as a slight, is Trump going to be able to just have his back, or is Trump going to lash out at him?
Well, on that last part, I think everything we've seen from Donald Trump suggests not. Donald Trump likes people who like him, whether it's Vladimir Putin. He praised Vladimir Putin because he said Vladimir Putin said nice things about him, or his reversal, of course, on Barack Obama, who he criticized so vociferously during the campaign, but suddenly has nice things to say about him because Barack Obama is sort of trying to thread the needle with Donald Trump. I think that we, in the press, will be on the lookout for anything that anyone in his cabinet, let alone someone like Mitt Romney, who has a history of butting heads with him, says that could be perceived as showing some airspace between them. We will jump on that and note that, and then I think Donald Trump, given his inclination, would be hard pressed to not respond.
And Steve, remember, this is an uncomfortable position that is not foreign to, or not unique to Donald Trump. Look at Colin Powell in George W. Bush's administration. He oftentimes bit his tongue, when a lot of the neocons and the hawks were going into Iraq, going into, so making this case that they're weapons of mass destruction. And he really privately disagreed, and a lot of his disagreements were leaked to the press, and that sort of hobbled his relationship with Bush. And so the big question is, I don't know that Mitt Romney's ever going to be an insider in the Trump team in this case. The way that, for example, Hillary Clinton was an insider on Barack Obama's team, but he certainly could be a very effective Secretary of State the way Colin Powell was.
All right. Ken Vogel, Jay Newton Small, thanks to both of you for joining us.